Resuming debate, the honourable member Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Just verifying, this is a 10-minute speech, correct? Yes, thank you. It's an honor to rise tonight and pursue the discussion of a very complex piece of legislation. It didn't start out as a complex when our colleague initially put it forward as Bill C-234, but I appreciate the opportunity to speak to it. Of course, this is the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act as it relates to on-farm use of fossil fuels. It's now been amended in the Senate to exempt one of the larger uses of fossil fuels on farm. So, of course, the farm community is not pleased. But I wanted to step back, and of course, this piece that is now would be exempted under the Senate amendments is the use on farm of propane fuel for grain drying. In other words, activities that take place in buildings are now no longer exempt from the fossil fuel exemption that came through in the first version of Bill C-234. And as the Green Party members and myself voted for Bill C-234 in its first iteration, I wanted to take advantage of the opportunity, if I may, to explain why we voted that way, what I think we should do for a fundamental reconsideration of the way we price carbon on farm so that it has some coherence intellectually and scientifically. So let me first start by why we voted for C-234 in its first iteration. I recall really clearly when carbon pricing came forward, which we favor, being very clear. We think you can't, without monetizing carbon, if you treat pollution as something free, nobody is paying attention to what it really costs society, what it really costs humanity to treat the atmosphere as if it's a large, free garbage dump for our pollution. That's clearly not acceptable. And we moved forward accepting that there would be and unfortunately, it's a patchwork because some provinces had already moved forward. British Columbia brought in Canada's first carbon tax, a well-constructed and logical revenue-neutral approach to carbon pricing. And there have been changes, and then some provinces brought in their own versions, and then what the federal government brought forward, the current Liberal government brought forward something that was essentially a backstop. So those provinces that didn't have their own systems, the federal government brought in a carbon price that would apply everywhere to try to equalize the pricing between all the different provinces and have a system that remained revenue neutral. Now, when British Columbia brought in the revenue neutral carbon tax under the government of previous Premier Gordon Campbell, who's pretty much representing the right wing on BC politics, but a really well-designed carbon price, the revenue neutral part of it was that as British Columbians, we got tax cuts that were how we received what is now, for those backstop provinces, citizens actually receive a check as a rebate. So this became a bit more complicated perhaps than it needed to be. But when the Liberals brought this in, they said, we're not going to apply it on farm. Farmers won't have to pay the carbon tax. Now that at least was how it was communicated. So when farmers realized that, well, we're not paying a carbon tax on the diesel we put in our tractors or the farm equipment we're using, but we're paying a big one on grain drying, they became quite concerned, and that's the source of Bill C-234. And we felt, and I felt, in principle, once you've told the farming community you're not going to apply a carbon tax to them, you should stick to that. And it also happened that because of the climate crisis, the need for grain drying increased. Now, this is one of those things that may sound counterintuitive, of course, but we had what farmers in the prairies called that winter, and I'm going to back up and just say, I know that it's not the first time that we've ever had the need for grain drying. We've had wet harvests before. It wasn't a novelty, but it was particularly bad. And farmers referred to it as the harvest from hell. They were still trying to get crops out of the fields when there was snow on the fields. The grain drying became much more intense, and the use of propane for grain drying actually increased. And that's when farmers said, well, wait a minute, we were supposed to be exempt from carbon pricing. Now, I want to step back from all this and say, before diving into what's happened to C-234 since then, if we wanted to monetize carbon and preferably keep farmers who are essentially land stewards, keep them on board with the need to respond to the climate crisis, How would you do that? I'll also say the reason that farmers should be particularly on board with measures to reduce greenhouse gases and avoid an ever worsening climate crisis is that if there's one economic sector that is a big loser and at risk in climate crisis world, it's agriculture, where sustained in the prairies now, it's a multi-year drought. Some of my friends who are farmers in the prairies, they don't call it a drought, call it aridification, because it's going to just keep getting drier because of climate trends, because of global warming. The impact on the cost of food, I mean, we talk about inflation in grocery prices. A good chunk of that is the impact on certain food products, certain agricultural products, because of extreme climate events, whether droughts or floods, or extreme weather events that wipe out certain kinds of foods. The price of vanilla went sky high because of the impact of storms hitting Madagascar, as but one example. And of course, grains all around the world started costing a lot more, combination of Putin declaring war on Ukraine, but also crop failures caused by climatic extreme events. So as someone who wants to see us all pull together, it was distressing to see that one component of Canadian society that both is severely impacted by climate crisis and therefore should be on side with doing something to keep it from becoming ever worse, and a part of our society that plays a big role in how carbon is sequestered would be alienated from efforts to act on climate by what felt like, and kind of, got to say, looked like, a betrayal on a promise. If you say you're not going to apply carbon taxes on farms, and then people are surprised, farmers are surprised to find, well, paying a walloping carbon tax, how did that happen? Well, I think it's because, and I'm sorry for my liberal friends, but I don't think they really understand a lot about farming, and they didn't realize that fossil fuels used on farm were largely used in buildings to dry grain when they made the promise. So fine to exempt tractors, fine to exempt on-farm equipment. But here we come to the crux of what I wish we had done in the 3 minutes I have left to express what I wish we had done, which perhaps we still could do, which is to enlist farmers as the creative land stewards that they are, and as farmers sequester carbon through their practices and on-farm activities such as zero-tillage agriculture, such as getting rid of summer fallows, such as making sure you're doing more perennial crops and fewer annual, are massively effective at sequestering carbon in soil. And guess what? We talk about planting forests as a way of sequestering carbon. Carbon sinks in forests. Those are real, that's true. But right now, and largely due to climate change, our grasslands are better at sequestering carbon than our forests. Why? Well, we want to make sure the soils hold an enormous quantity of carbon in the soil. And unlike climate conditions causing forest fires that wipe out the carbon we were sequestering in forests, releasing it by the millions of tons to the atmosphere in a summer like not just summer, we started having every province in this country having wildfires that were out of control in the spring, in May of last year, all the way through to late fall, and some into the winter. When forests burn, you lose all the carbon. But here's something interesting, and scientists are looking at this a lot. When grasslands burn, you don't lose all the carbon because most of that carbon is stored well below the soil in the root systems that don't burn. So if you're offsetting for greenhouse gases, well, I generally think you're better not to plant a tree, but to plant a billionaire. But I usually say that in jest, so just to make sure everybody understands it. But you're better off to protect your grasslands. And where ecosystems exist with grasslands, it's better to sustain them and keep them robust, which means, what if, instead of just having carbon pricing on the fuel you burn, we paid farmers for sequestering every ton of carbon they sequester? What if we had an actual balance sheet on carbon pricing, thanking and rewarding farmers who have taken on board protecting ecological services, wetlands, protecting biodiversity, and making sure they are both restoring the health of soil, improving the profitability, the health of the food, and keeping carbon out of the atmosphere. Thank you farmers.
Resuming debate. Reprise de débat. Reprise de débat. The honourable member for West Vancouver, Sunshine Coast, Sea to Sky Country.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's a privilege to resume debate on Private Member's Bill 234 pursuant to the proposed amendments to this bill from the Senate. Canada has the best farmers and food processors in the world. We're a global leader in agricultural production, and the sector